At 19 years old, Darius Vance murdered his 8-year-old cousin in the sun-drenched woods of Oak Creek Community Park, a place designed for laughter and childhood innocence, shattering the late August afternoon with an act of incomprehensible brutality. The murder weapon was not a knife or a gun, but his own hands, the very hands that had, just an hour earlier, pushed her on the swings as she squealed with delight. He was the family member entrusted with her care, the older cousin she looked up to, and his betrayal was as absolute as the silence that followed her final moments beneath the canopy of indifferent oak trees. The contrast between the idyllic setting and the savage reality of the crime would become a central, haunting theme for the investigators and the community, forced to confront the darkness that had walked among them, hidden behind a familiar face. As we delve into the intricate details of this case, from the first frantic 911 call to the final, explosive moments in a courtroom, we invite you to become part of our community dedicated to understanding these complex tragedies. If you appreciate in-depth investigative storytelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts on the case in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. Now, we return to the afternoon of August 22nd, a day that began with the simple, joyful promise of a trip to the park. The day had dawned clear and warm, a perfect late summer Tuesday in the suburban enclave of Northwood. Keisha Scott, a single mother working as a cardiac nurse, had a rare afternoon off and wanted to spend it with her daughter, Imani. Imani, a vibrant second grader with bright, curious eyes and 2 perpetually crooked pigtails, was the center of Keisha's world. She loved the color yellow, strawberry ice cream, and the big slide at Oak Creek Park. That afternoon, she wore a brand new yellow sundress, a gift from her grandmother, and white sandals that scuffed the pavement as she skipped ahead of her mother on the way to the car. Keisha's nephew, Darius Vance, had been living with them for 3 months. His own mother, Keisha's sister, had sent him to Northwood hoping a change of scenery and Keisha's steadying influence might curb his growing apathy and minor delinquencies. At 19, Darius was a study in quiet contradiction. He could be polite and helpful, yet his eyes often held a distant, unreadable sullenness. He spent most of his time in his room, the muffled bass of his headphones a constant, low thrum against his bedroom door. Keisha saw him as a work in progress, a boy who just needed structure and love. Imani, with the uncomplicated affection of a child, simply adored him. He was her big cousin, the one who could lift her effortlessly onto the monkey bars. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Keisha announced the park trip. Imani's immediate excitement was infectious, but Darius, slouched on the sofa scrolling through his phone, was noncommittal. Keisha, needing to run a quick errand to the pharmacy before it closed, asked Darius if he would take Imani to the park for an hour, promising to meet them there as soon as she was done. She handed him $20 for snacks. "Get her some ice cream," she said, smiling. "The strawberry kind," Darius agreed with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the screen of his phone. The walk to the park was short, only 4 blocks through a neighborhood of tidy lawns and manicured hedges. Neighbors would later recall seeing the pair, a lanky young man in a dark gray hoodie despite the heat, and a small, skipping girl in a brilliant yellow dress, a stark visual contrast. They arrived at Oak Creek Park just before 3 p.m. The park was alive with the familiar sounds of a weekday afternoon, the rhythmic creak of swing sets, the shouts of children playing tag on the open field, the distant rumble of a lawnmower. For 45 minutes, everything appeared normal. Darius pushed Imani on the swings, his expression impassive. He followed her to the slide, watching from the bottom as she slid down again and again. Another parent, Jennifer Albright, sitting on a nearby bench, would later testify that she noticed the young man seemed disengaged, almost bored, a stark difference to the effervescent energy of the little girl. At approximately 3:45 p.m., Darius bought Imani a strawberry ice cream cone from the park's concession stand. They sat at a picnic table, Imani happily licking the dripping dessert, while Darius stared out toward the dense line of trees that marked the park's western boundary. This was the entrance to the Oak Creek Nature Trail, a less trafficked area of the park that wound its way down to a shallow, rocky creek bed. It was after Imani finished her ice cream that Darius suggested they go for a walk on the trail to look for cool rocks. This was the last time anyone, other than her killer, would see Imani Scott alive. Keisha Scott arrived at the park at 4:15 p.m., her errand having taken longer than expected. She scanned the playground, her eyes searching for a flash of yellow. She didn't see one. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She walked the perimeter of the playground, then the ball fields, calling Imani's name. Her calls were swallowed by the cheerful noise of the park. She tried calling Darius's cell phone. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second, the third, the fourth. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. By 5:30 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the empty swings. Keisha, her voice now raw with fear, was running through the park, shouting for her daughter. At 6:02 p.m., her hands trembling so badly she could barely dial, she called 911. The first patrol unit, Car 314, arrived on the scene at 6:08 p.m., manned by Officer David Miller, a 10-year veteran of the Northwood Police Department. He found Keisha Scott near the playground, her face streaked with tears, her voice a torrent of panicked information. Miller's professional calm was a stark counterpoint to her hysteria. He took down the descriptions. Imani, 8 years old, 4 feet 2 inches, wearing a yellow sundress. Darius Vance, 19, 6 feet tall, last seen in a gray hoodie and dark jeans. As more officers arrived, a systematic grid search of the 88-acre park began. The sun disappeared completely, and the park, once a place of light and joy, became a dark, menacing landscape illuminated only by the sweeping beams of police flashlights. It was shortly after 9 p.m. that 2 officers, methodically working their way down the poorly lit nature trail, noticed something out of place. A small, white sandal lay on its side just off the path. Following a faint trail of disturbed leaves leading toward the creek, they made the discovery. Tucked into a shallow depression, partially covered with hastily gathered leaves and branches, was Imani's small body. The yellow of her dress was sullied with dirt and blood. Officer Miller, who had joined the search on the trail, was the one who made the official confirmation. The silence that fell over the search party was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of a single, grief-stricken wail that echoed from the playground when the news reached Keisha Scott. The investigation fell to Detective Miles Harding, a quiet, meticulous man whose reputation was built on his unwavering attention to detail. He arrived at the secured crime scene just before 10 p.m. The area was now bathed in the harsh, artificial light of portable generators. The atmosphere was somber and intensely focused. Harding's first action was to walk the perimeter, observing the scene from a distance, letting the initial, unfiltered reality of it sink in. The forensic team moved with practiced efficiency, their work a slow, deliberate ballet of evidence collection. They photographed everything: the sandal on the path, the drag marks in the soil, the disturbed foliage. They collected fiber samples from Imani's dress and fingernail scrapings, hoping the child had left a mark on her attacker. Every leaf and twig covering her body was collected and bagged as potential evidence. While the crime scene was being processed, the search for Darius Vance was underway. A bolo, "Be on the lookout," was issued, but the search was surprisingly short. At 10:45 p.m., 2 detectives dispatched to Keisha Scott's home found him there. He was in his room, sitting on his bed in the dark, listening to music through his headphones. He was wearing a clean t-shirt and basketball shorts. When questioned, his story was simple and delivered with a disconcerting lack of emotion. He claimed that Imani had wanted to play hide-and-seek near the trail, and that she had run off to hide. He said he looked for her for a while, and when he couldn't find her, he assumed she had gotten tired and walked home on her own. He then came home himself. He claimed his phone had died, which was why he hadn't answered his aunt's calls. The detectives noted the inconsistencies immediately. Why would an 8-year-old walk home alone? Why hadn't he called for help or found his aunt in the park? They also noted a fresh, thin scratch running down his right cheek, from his temple to his jawline. When asked about it, Darius mumbled that he'd done it himself, scratching an itch. He was asked to come to the station for a formal interview. He agreed without protest. At the Northwood Police Headquarters, under the sterile fluorescent lights of Interrogation Room 2, Darius Vance's composure began to fray. Detective Harding led the questioning, his voice calm and even. He didn't accuse. He simply asked Darius to walk him through the afternoon again and again. With each retelling, small but significant details in Darius's story shifted. The time he claimed they separated changed. The direction Imani supposedly ran in was different. Harding presented him with the facts as they were being discovered. A witness, a teenager named Leo Martinez who had been walking his dog, had come forward. He reported seeing a young man matching Darius's description in a heated argument with a little girl in a yellow dress near the entrance to the nature trail around 4 p.m. He said the girl was crying and the young man had grabbed her arm forcefully, pulling her onto the path. Darius denied it flatly. "That wasn't me," he said, his eyes fixed on the metal table between them. The evidence, however, was beginning to tell its own story, one that directly contradicted his. The gray hoodie and jeans he had been wearing were found stuffed at the bottom of his laundry hamper. They were damp and had faint traces of mud on the knees. Forensics would later confirm the soil from the jeans was a perfect match to the unique mineral composition of the soil at the creek bed where Imani was found. The scratch on his cheek was swabbed for DNA. Underneath his own fingernails, technicians found microscopic epithelial cells. The DNA profile from those cells would be a match to one person, Imani Scott. The case against Darius was solidifying, built brick by brick with forensic precision. But the most damning evidence came from the digital world he inhabited. A warrant was obtained for his cell phone. While the phone had been wiped, forensic specialists were able to recover recently deleted data. They found a series of text messages sent to a friend 2 days before the murder. In them, Darius vented a deep, simmering rage. He complained about his Aunt Keisha, about having to babysit, about feeling disrespected and trapped. One message, sent at 1:17 a.m. on August 21st, was chillingly prophetic. "I'm so sick of this. Sick of them all. I feel like I'm going to explode. Someone's going to pay for making me feel like nothing." The medical examiner's report painted a grim picture of Imani's final moments. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. There were defensive wounds on her arms and hands, and the DNA under Darius's nails confirmed she had fought back against her cousin, her trusted guardian. Faced with the overwhelming physical and digital evidence during a third interview, Darius's denial cracked, but not in the way detectives expected. He didn't confess. Instead, he shifted blame. "She wouldn't listen," he said, his voice low and venomous. "She was always talking, always wanting something. She wouldn't be quiet. I just wanted her to be quiet." It was not a confession of guilt, but an admission of motive, a terrifying glimpse into a mind where a child's insistence was grounds for a death sentence. Darius Vance was formally charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. The district attorney, citing the brutal nature of the crime, the age of the victim, and the betrayal of trust, announced her intention to seek the death penalty. The trial of the people versus Darius Vance began 6 months later, in February, in the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom of the Northwood County Courthouse. The trial became a media spectacle, a local tragedy turned into a national headline. The courtroom was packed every day, a silent testament to the community's horror. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Eleanor Rios, meticulously constructed their case. They presented the jury with a mountain of evidence, a narrative of cold, calculated violence. They showed the crime scene photos, the muddy jeans, the fiber analysis reports that linked Darius's hoodie to Imani's dress with near certainty. Leo Martinez, the teenager from the park, gave his testimony, his voice shaking as he identified Darius as the young man he saw arguing with Imani. The most heart-wrenching moment of the trial came when Keisha Scott took the stand. Dressed in black, her face a mask of controlled grief, she spoke of her daughter's love for life, her infectious laugh, her unwavering trust in her cousin. When Rios asked her to identify a photograph of Imani, a beautiful school picture of her smiling, Keisha broke down, her sobs echoing in the hushed courtroom. The defense, led by public defender Alistair Finch, was left with an almost impossible task. They could not dispute that Darius was with Imani or that his DNA was at the scene. Their strategy was to argue diminished capacity, to paint Darius as a psychologically damaged young man from a broken home, lashing out in a moment of uncontrollable rage rather than premeditated malice. They brought in a psychologist who testified about Darius's troubled childhood and antisocial tendencies. But under cross-examination from Rios, The psychologist had to concede that Darius knew the difference between right and wrong. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. The verdict was read by the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who avoided looking at the defendant. On the charge of kidnapping, we the jury find the defendant, Darius Vance, guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Darius Vance, guilty. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over the gallery. Keisha Scott closed her eyes and wept silently. Darius Vance showed no emotion. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. The sentencing phase took place 2 weeks later. It was a formality, but one imbued with immense weight. Imani's father, who had been largely absent from her life, gave a victim impact statement, his voice choked with regret. Keisha Scott submitted a written statement, unable to bear speaking in court again. He didn't just take my daughter, it read. He took the sun. He took all the light from my world. Finally, it was time for Judge Marcus Thorne to deliver the sentence. He looked down from the bench, his gaze fixed on Darius. He spoke of the sanctity of childhood, the profound violation of trust, and the chilling lack of remorse the defendant had displayed throughout the proceedings. This was not an act of passion, Judge Thorne stated, his voice booming with authority. This was an act of profound evil, perpetrated against a defenseless child who loved and trusted you. This court finds that the aggravating circumstances in this case far outweigh any mitigating factors. Therefore, pursuant to the laws of this state, and in accordance with the jury's recommendation, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you, Darius Vance, be put to death. It was at the utterance of the words, "put to death," that the mask of indifference Darius had worn for months finally shattered. For a split second, he sat frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then, a guttural roar erupted from deep within him. It was a sound of pure, primal rage. He launched himself forward, flipping the heavy oak defense table with an explosive burst of strength. It crashed to the floor with a sound like a gunshot. "No!" he screamed, his face contorted into a mask of fury, spittle flying from his lips. "You can't do this to me. You old bastard." He lunged toward the judge's bench, his hands clawed, his eyes wild. Courtroom deputies, who had been standing at ease, surged forward. It took 4 of them to subdue him. He thrashed and kicked, his screams echoing off the marble walls, a torrent of profanity and threats directed at the judge, at the prosecutor, at the weeping family of the little girl he had murdered. He screamed Imani's name, not in remorse, but as a curse. The courtroom devolved into chaos. Spectators gasped and cried out. Keisha Scott was quickly escorted out by victim advocates, shielded from the horrific spectacle of her nephew's final, violent unraveling. Darius was dragged, still fighting, from the courtroom, his enraged bellows audible long after he had disappeared from view. The aftermath left a permanent scar on the community of Northwood. Oak Creek Park was forever changed. The nature trail was officially closed, and a memorial garden for Imani Scott was planted near the playground, a splash of yellow flowers a constant, somber reminder. Keisha Scott quit her job and moved away, unable to remain in a house filled with memories. She became a quiet but staunch advocate for child abuse awareness programs. Darius Vance was transported to the state's maximum security prison, where he resides on death row. His appeals have all been exhausted. He spends his days in a 6 by 9-foot cell, the quiet rage that he contained for so long, now his only constant companion. The explosive outburst in the courtroom was the last time the world would see the true nature of the man who took his young cousin to the park for ice cream and left her in a shallow grave. It was a final, horrifying glimpse of the darkness that had hidden in plain sight, a darkness that ultimately consumed not only the bright, beautiful life of an 8-year-old girl, but his own as well, leaving behind nothing but irreversible tragedy and the lingering question of how such a thing could ever have happened on a sunny summer afternoon.